Hello, welcome to my February update / March TBR reading plans video, whatever you want to call it. I'm finding this last year that the authors and books that seem to impact me the most are the ones that prove me wrong about what I think I will love or not love in books. So I have a few examples in this video actually, but before getting into that, the first book I finished in the month of February was Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. Now, this is a Chinese mythology-inspired fantasy story about a young girl whose mother is the moon goddess who is held prisoner on the moon. The girl breaks away right around when she's coming of age, and her whole mission is to free her mother by going up against the most dangerous immortal in all of the realm. And I really enjoyed this for the most part. I listened to it on audio. I had a little bit of a problem adjusting to maybe the narrator or the prose style, which was very flowery and descriptive and kind of unbelievable for me a little bit, coming from such a young girl. But at the same time, I enjoyed the sort of whimsical settings. It does have a love triangle. It does follow the typical YA tropes you would assume it does. And it was executed okay. I just find that when it comes to YA books, I rarely feel motivated to continue a series past the first book. And when I picked this up, I thought it was a standalone. So I was a little disappointed to find out it's actually maybe a duology, maybe a series. I find that my enjoyment usually significantly drops when I try to continue YA series for whatever reason. And I usually feel like the first books can stand as standalones, but that's just me. And I know a lot of people love this book. So if any of the whimsical, sort of Chinese-inspired mythology sounds appealing to you, I wouldn't hesitate to pick this up. I also want to mention that I think I was in the mood to pick this up, not only because of the beautiful cover, and I thought that Chinese-inspired fantasy sounded fun. I also picked this up because I was kind of in a mood for something a little more whimsical after having read the Winter Night trilogy by Katherine Arden. And I bring this up for a couple of reasons. One, because I was just talking about exceptions. Now that I would consider a YA trilogy, the Winter Night trilogy, but unlike any other YA series or trilogy I've ever read, that one actually for me tended to get better and better as I went along, and I ended up loving the trilogy. I loved it so much, and actually I just participated in a live show on She Was Only Evie's channel for the third book with some other wonderful booktubers. So this book, The Winter of the Witch, which by the way, this is my library's copy and it happens to be a signed copy, which is pretty neat, but I thoroughly loved this book. I loved this trilogy and the character of Vasya at the heart of it. Now, this is a Russian folklore-inspired fantasy series, and it beautifully interweaves the historical fiction aspects along with the whimsy and magic of the forest setting, the atmosphere, the cold winter settings, and then you also get wonderful family dynamics in this. You get a wonderful romantic relationship that blossoms throughout the trilogy. And I love the interplay between magic and religion. And we talked about the theme of coexistence in that live show. It is full of spoilers, but I just was so moved by Katherine Arden's beautiful writing style and the beautiful themes that were so heartfelt for me by the end of this trilogy. I just thoroughly enjoyed it. It was such a huge surprise for me. I mean, I finished this whole trilogy in January pretty much, and it's just been the biggest surprise of the year in a way for me. So I was so grateful to participate in that live show, but I think it is what put me in the mood for some more whimsical fantasy. So the next book I finished in the month of February is Altered Traits by Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson. I buddy read this with Brandon from Brandon's Bookshelf. We did a pre-read book chat about this over on his channel. I'll link that below. And we are going to have a post-read discussion eventually. I will keep you all updated when that comes. So I know this is nonfiction and it might not seem like it appeals to everybody, but a few things about this. First of all, I know some people did mention in one of my last videos that they were very interested in getting into meditation or mindfulness. Now, I will say this book is not a guide. It's not a how to meditate or practice anything. It's just talking about what the scientists have found who've studied these and what they found with large sample sizes or, with groups of people who've practiced meditation over years and how it's altered the brain. So I think this could also appeal to readers because I think a lot of us who promote literature talk about these same things that are studied in the brain according to this type of research on meditation and mindfulness. So there are 4 neural pathways. One of those neural pathways has to do with responding to stressful situations. So I know that we talk about in literature how literature helps us maybe escape from the world or from stressful situations. But I have heard people talk about how doing so and going into a book and engaging with stressful situations that characters go through might help us to better engage with those situations in real life. Now, whether that's been studied or not, I don't know, but it was studied according to meditation practices and that neural pathway in the brain and showing a lot of benefit there. Another neural pathway that is discussed in this book had to do with concentration skills or our focus of attention. And as readers, of course, we want to promote our concentration skills to better understand and absorb what we're reading about. So that's actually been found to be a benefit with certain types of meditation practices. Now, they are very specific about what types of practices affect which neural pathway. But the third one that I always hear people talk about is about empathy and compassion. And I always hear about people talking about how literature promotes empathy. And I've even heard of a study that talked about that. I do question that a little bit. I would like to read more research about that. But of course, they have found that with specific practices, especially the loving kindness meditation, where you imagine bringing love and kindness and freedom of suffering first to yourself, which apparently is really hard to do for most people, and then extending that to the world, to loved ones, to people that you also struggle with, and people that you have neutral feelings towards, that this can create an incredible effect on the brain and not only promote empathy as far as like cognitive empathy, but emotional empathy, and more importantly, empathic concern, which is very different. So they discuss that in this book as well. And I just loved that discussion. That was one of my favorites, by the way. And then the 4th neural pathway has to do with your sense of self, which whatever that is. So obviously, I think I hear a lot of people talk in literature about how your sense of self is kind of affected by what you read. I've gotten the question in tags a few times, what's a book that changed your life? Which I always find kind of hard to answer, but there is evidence, of course, that practicing meditation and mindfulness can affect your concept of self. So I found this book very, very interesting for a lot of reasons, and I'm going to go way more in depth with this with Brandon in our post discussion eventually. There's a lot more. I'm barely scratching the surface on what this book has. But this is, again, more science heavy. It's not that you have to have a big research background to understand any of it. It's told in a very understandable, approachable manner. But it's, again, not a how-to, not a guide, and it strips all of the sort of, it tries to go down to the bare bones of practice and effects on the brain. So if that interests you at all, you might want to check it out. I think it's a very interesting topic. Another book I read in the month of February is The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie, which I did a spoiler-free review about, so I won't go into detail here. One thing I'll add, though, I will add a couple of things here, though, really quickly. So although I did discuss in my review about how this is kind of a war military kind of book in a way, I mean, it says 3 men, 1 battle, no heroes. One thing that Larry from Larry Has Opinions pointed out in his wrap-up, he also did a wonderful review of this book too, if you're interested, also spoiler-free. But one thing he pointed out is that although it's a battle book and he's not a big fan of battles, it actually doesn't have many battle scenes in it, believe it or not. You don't really engage that much in battle. So if you're one of those people that doesn't like battle in your fantasy, and you're not alone, I feel like a lot of people don't worry. This is actually a lot more about the politicking and commentary around those scenes, especially on what it means to be a hero and how much of your humanity do you have to sacrifice to be a hero, and how much actually of your human stupidity comes out in order to be a hero. So I just was thoroughly entertained with this book. And another thing I really enjoyed about this book that I didn't mention in my review is the indifferent role of nature that it plays out in this book. I found that so entertaining. So for example, maybe the characters in the book are going through some very dark, menacing thoughts about things, and then meanwhile, the sun is shining and the birds are chirping. Tweet, bloody tweet, I think is what one of the characters thinks. And I thought that was so funny. And it seemed like the weather didn't even quite match up with how characters wanted things to be. So I just found that really interesting too. I felt like that was kind of something that shows you about how little the first law world really cares about about what's happening. It's so funny. Anyway, so I just really enjoyed this book. And, it doesn't, even with the battle scenes, it doesn't quite have the same type of epic battle scenes that I tend to love, because I tend to love battle in my books. But this isn't that. And so again, it's another one of those kind of exception books. Now, when I did do a video on things I'm loving in books right now. And I was clear in that video that it wasn't a checklist, that not everything I mentioned had to be in books. But it is interesting that there is obviously a lot of focus on battle and war in this book, but it wasn't really the type that I necessarily gravitate towards, but I still thoroughly enjoyed my time reading this. So again, I have a spoiler-free review for this book, and in my spoiler-free review, I don't even give character names. So if you've never read a First Law book before, you're not going to be spoiled in that review. Another book I read in the month of February goes way outside of my comfort zone, and that is An Inventory of Losses by Judith Shalonsky. So this is a fairly short book. It was translated from German by Jackie Smith, and it is so unique. This is one of the most unique genre-defined books I have ever read. It is sort of part history, part fiction, part memoir. Each chapter is kind of written in a very different type of style, sometimes more intimate, almost more character driven, sometimes more of like a sort of history perspective. And basically, it's a book about losses. It's a book about what history doesn't tell you. It's a book about what we've lost over time with civilization, lost languages, lost cultures, lost mythologies, lost everything you can imagine. And it's told in so many different ways, but each chapter kind of focuses on one specific thing, whether it's Sapphos's poetry or the extinction of animals or lost types of religions. And it's just very, very interesting the way it explores it. There are intimate sort of perspectives on loss and more broad ones. So I kind of felt like it was a macro and micro perspective of loss and the ways that we humans fill in the spaces of that loss through history, through time. And it's so fascinating because I feel like in history, we focus so much on what we know. And I feel like this book is sort of an ode to what we don't know and really embracing that in a very creative way. And I think also another thing that I found very intriguing and fascinating about this book, every chapter was just absolutely fascinating, I'll say that. But one thing I found really interesting is just the way, and you get this even from the preface alone, how Shalonsky sees this loss or sees extinction, sees what we are forgetting or choosing to lose or not in choosing to lose, whether by accident or luck or fate or whatever you want to call it. How she looks at these things with different sort of perspectives. So I feel like there is a lens of lament, of tragedy behind what we've lost, but there's also the perspective of wonder and curiosity about it, and at the same time criticism, because sometimes we've lost things as an actful will of imperialism, colonization, war, you name it. So sometimes things have been lost intentionally for powerful motivations or whatever reasons. So I think it was just interesting to see all these different sort of perspectives. There's also a quote too at the beginning: to forget everything is bad, certainly. Worse still is to forget nothing. After all, knowledge can only be gained by forgetting. So in other words, we actually make meaning out of our lives because we have forgotten certain things. That's what causes us to make meaning of what we do hold on to, and how little is it that we actually have, that we think we have so much knowledge, but how little is it compared to what we've lost. And so if we were able to keep hold of everything in our minds, she compares that to like a database, then it kind of would almost lose meaning in a way. So it's just very interesting the way she explores it. It's very provocative at times. It is, it almost felt a little nihilistic at times, but it also felt at times wondrous and intriguing. And at the same time, I just felt like dizzy, almost like the sense you get when you're, You realize you're a little speck on a tiny little planet in this huge, vast universe. That kind of dizzying effect, and the idea that you're even alive at all is just dizzying. That's sort of what I got from this book, as well as a sort of weird, intimate experience of it too, because the author actually happens to be my age, and I had a very strange experience when reading this book in which she talks about her earliest memory. There's one chapter where she's talking from her own perspective, and she talks about her earliest memory falling from a window of a very high height. I don't think it was a second story, but what was weird about that is that my earliest memory is falling out of a second story window. And actually, according to my brother and his friend who saw me fall, I flew out the window. But what's weird is that the outcome the aftermath of what we experienced with that experience was very, very different from one another. But it's strange because we're the same age, and that was our earliest memory. So it feels like that could have happened at the same time at different parts of the world. So very strange. I had a very strange experience when I read that chapter, because even when she was approaching the edge of the window, I kind of had memories of what I was thinking and feeling in that moment. So it's just an interesting exploration, very unique book. I actually, even though it's not a fantasy, it does reference unicorns at one point. I'll say that. And I don't know who to recommend this to, but I picked up this book thanks to Sean from the channel Travel Through Stories. His review is just fantastic. He actually compared it to the medieval sentiment of life being transient, and the way he talked about what we've lost and what history hasn't told. It did very much make me think about Malazan, I won't lie. So I really wanted to pick it up for that reason. But another excellent review too is Brandon from Brandon's Bookshelf. He also reviewed the book. And then after watching those two reviews, I thought, okay, I give up. I need to read this book. I dare you to watch those two reviews. They go into it much more in detail than I am here. And see if you want to pick it up after watching those two reviews, because they were so good. They tipped me over. I had to go and check it out. Now I'm going to go into the books I'll be reading in March. And because I just spoke about Sean's channel, Travel Through Stories, I'll go ahead and mention that I'll be reading The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, thanks to Sean's wonderful review on this book. It actually made it into one of his top books of last year. And after watching his review, in which he talked about this concept of double consciousness, which I think also kind of is maybe connected to intersectionality, I'm not totally sure. It sounded so intriguing, and I understand it's a multi-generational story that takes place in a fictional town in Georgia, USA, and I happen to live in Georgia. So I'm very curious about this book, and when I was listening to Sean's review, I don't know why, but something about it made me think that Brittany might enjoy this book. It might be something that she was talking about at the time, I'm not sure, but I went ahead and gifted that to her for her birthday. So we're buddy reading this together in the month of March. And it is a huge book. I didn't really quite think about that when I gifted that to her, because I know she's been a bit fatigued on big books, as have I. But I'm still really looking forward to it, especially after hearing Sean's review again, and hope we both enjoy it. I've never read anything by W.E.B. Du Bois before. I didn't even think about that until I saw a video by the Codex Cantina a couple weeks ago in which they analyzed a short piece by him. And it was so good. The analysis was so good that I'm thinking I probably need to read some W.E.B. Du Bois at some point. The Codex Cantina is another one of those channels that gets me interested in reading outside of fantasy, outside my comfort zone, which I guess fantasy has kind of become a comfort zone for me. The other book that I'm reading in the month of March is fantasy, and I'm actually in the middle of it right now, and that is Wizard and Glass by Stephen King. I am loving this book so far. I am immersed. I am so immersed. And I know a lot of people consider this their favorite Dark Tower book, and I just love it. I've had it from the library for a long time. I actually read a chunk of it before starting The Heroes and then put it aside, and now I'm back into it, and I just love it. So this is actually how I'm starting the month. And last book I have to mention for the month of March, I just had to go run to pick up this book from my shelf. The last book that I have to read for the month of March is The God Is Not Willing by Stephen Erickson. And I'll be buddy reading this with Alan and discussing it with Alan and Jimmy, Fantasy Network, and Alan from the Library of Alexandria. And I think we're going to be discussing this on Alan's channel, so I'm so excited for it. I've heard many things about this. For one thing, It's a shorter book than, a typical Malazan Book of the Fallen book. It's 475 pages, is that right? I understand that it reads fairly quickly, that it's not quite as dense as some of those other Malazan books. I'm not sure, but I'm very excited about it. I love Stephen Eriksen's writing, obviously, and it'll be so much fun to discuss this with Alan and Jimmy. That's a wonderful way to conclude the month. Let me know what books you're picking up this next month. Obviously, I've been branching out a lot in genre, but still reading some good fantasy and excited to see how this will turn out. So let me know your thoughts on anything I shared, or let me know what you're reading. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.